Friends, let's talk about tenohira, the Japanese word for palm healing, referring to the hands-on healing element of the system of Reiki. And let's explore the questions of one, is it important that a Reiki practitioner follow a specifically prescribed series of hand placements during a tenohira session every time we provide a session? And is there a way of approaching the hand placements that is more trauma informed than others? Whether you are a Reiki practitioner, a Reiki client, or just Reiki curious, there should be something in here that will promote some thinking, some reflection, and hopefully provide some value on your journey. So friends, welcome back to Heartscapes, where we're learning the system of Reiki to live lives that are rooted, spacious, connected, and that to help us remember ourselves. My name is Michaela. Welcome back to the studio. So these questions are variations of the question of, do hand placements matter? And is there a way to provide a hands-on treatment that is more trauma-informed? Have come up several times with various students, clients, and casual conversation. So it seems to be a topic that is wanting a little bit of discussion. So wanted to jump on here and look at kind of take that opportunity to reflect on how I feel about those questions and to share a bit of that with you. We are going to talk about hand placements generally, how one might approach the working with the series of hand placements and looking at that question, does it matter if that we follow a specifically prescribed series of hand placements? And then we will talk about this other question of, is there a way to provide a hands-on healing treatment that is more trauma-informed once we do that generalized overview. I want to just start by saying that in this video, I really am presenting my opinion about this. I'm not presenting this as like, this is the absolute correct answer. I'm almost never presenting an absolute correct answer. It's always kind of what is the alchemy of my personal experience of providing Reiki sessions for 11 years, teaching for 8 years, and what have I learned from my teachers? What have I observed with other practitioners that has worked or not worked as well? And so in this particular instance, there really is a wide range of how we can answer this question. And so I'm not going to say that this is a correct way of approaching it. It's just my way of approaching it. So with that said, let's first just take a look at how we might think about hand placements generally within the system of Reiki and then within a tenohira session. So within the system of Reiki, from its Japanese origins, we generally categorize the elements into 5 primary elements with a series of practices associated with each. These elements are going to tend to lead with either the body, the mind, or the breath, or the voice. Those 3 aspects of ourself combining together, integrating together to create our full and complete experience of the world. And so the system of Reiki is very elegantly designed to integrate those 3 elements of ourselves, our body, our mind, and our breath or our voice, in ways that have practices that will lead with one or the other or many of them together. And so we see that reflected in the 5 elements themselves and in the specific practices within each of those elements. So those elements are, beginning with the precepts as the first element, the foundational element of the system of Reiki. The whole system of Reiki is designed to help us to live as an embodiment of those precepts. How do we get there? The other 4 elements get us there. So that is visualizations and breathwork, so meditative practices that bring together visualizations of the mind and particular breathing practices. That is kokyuho, so breathing methods. Then there is tenohira, so palm healing, the hands-on, very body-forward practice of using touch as a focal point. There is symbols and mantras, jumon and shurishi, which bring together both visualizations, contemplations of the symbols, and then recitation using the breath and the voice with the mantras. And then finally, we have the practice of reiju, or spiritual offering, which is a ritual that allows us to be fully present with our practice in a given moment, receiving whatever we need in that moment for our practice. And that is the Japanese element that shifted into what is often known as attunement in Western Reiki. And so within those practices, of course, you have various ways of approaching them. So looking at Tenohira, this is, of course, again, the palm healing aspect of the system of Reiki. And it's the one that I would say most often in Western practice is the emphasis. It's the one that's most often thought of as what providing Reiki is doing a hands-on healing session. Most of us, when we learn the system of Reiki, will learn a series of hand positions, a a map, if you will, of how we would approach offering Reiki in this way to a client or to ourselves. Those hand positions, loosely have been passed down from the founder of the system, Mikao Usui. There is some documentation of hand positions that he would have used, and then there's more documentation of hand positions that some of his more prominent students used after him. And those hand positions have been passed on from practitioner to practitioner, from teacher to student, with, as is often the case, modifications, shifts, changes, slight variations, major variations, as the system gets passed into more and more hands, spreading to more and more places over the 80 or so years that it has been in the Western world. And so as a result of that, we do have a wide range of what might be called a proper set of hand positions. But loosely, they all have in common that they work, major points of the whole body from head to toe, or in some cases from toe to head, and hitting kind of the major energy centers down the center channel of the body and the extremities, the arms and legs, and so on. So with that as our context of what it is that we're talking about, let's look at this question of how a practitioner might approach that, and does a specific series of positions matter? That is going to depend on who you ask. And there is, as in many things, a spectrum of, containing extremes and many, many, many steps in between. In this case, our extremes are represented by, on the one hand, a position that says, absolutely, the hand positions must be done in the correct order in exactly the same way for every session. This is a very, firm and structured and, we might even say rigid way of looking at following the hand positions. There is also a certain sense typically of honoring and respecting the tradition that was passed along, being able to recognize that there was meaning in a particular sequence of hand positions and respecting and sticking to that. There might also be a sense that the quality or the experience of the session itself is impacted by whether or not hand positions are done in a particular way, and therefore it is important to stay within that structure. So that would be one side of the spectrum. On the full, complete opposite side of the spectrum, you would have a just kind of fully fluid, maybe intuitive way of practicing, wherein a person might say, it doesn't matter at all what hand positions that you use. Maybe one does a completely different sequence every single time, or modifies it frequently, or does away with hand positions altogether and is really just more kind of in a free-flowing experience with their client. And really, that perspective saying that what's more important is following one's intuition, being connected with the client and with the moment, and that the firm structure of having a set of hand positions that you follow each time absolutely does not matter, and perhaps is even a constriction, an unnecessary, constriction on the practice. So I know people, like specific people who represent both sides of that extreme. So I'm kind of speaking, I kind of have this avatar of, particular people that I know take those positions. And I want to say that neither of those positions, from my perspective, are inherently wrong. I think each of them provides some limitation and some value. And I really wanted to kind of speak to some of the values in that introduction. What is the positive goal, intention, value that a practitioner might hold if they hold one of those extreme positions. My position, and how I've been practicing Reiki for many, many years, is somewhere in between. And it's really following the principle that is very central to the way that my current teacher, presents the system of Reiki, and really presents a framework for how we might approach life in general, which is the importance of balancing being both firm and flexible, being structured enough and consistent enough and diligent enough and connected to the traditions that we're following enough that we have a firm and supportive foundation for our practice. And flexible, being able to respond to the moment, to be limber and to be agile as things change, to be able to respond to the particular person or situation that we're working with in a session, including ourselves, if we're doing self-practice, which we should be doing that regularly. The need to really be in a dialogue with life, right? A call and response with what we are experiencing, with the fluidity of life, and to be able to respond. And from where do we respond? We respond from that firm, rooted, stable foundation that we have already developed. So again, this principle of being both firm and flexible, having a strong rooted foundation to grow from, and then from that firm rooted foundation, being able to move and respond and be nimble and to pivot in the moment. Often using the metaphor of a willow tree, well-rooted, able to move in the wind so that it does not break. I also often use the metaphor of a bull kelp, which is firmly rooted into the seafloor and then has this beautifully flexible seaweed body that is able to move in the ever-changing currents of the ocean. So what does that look like in a Tenohira session? So for me, and this is reflected both in the way that I was taught and in what has borne out to be true in my practice. It feels particularly true for me because it's come through both of those places, through receiving teachings that I trust and that I respect, and having those teachings borne out to be true and effective in my practice. So for me, that looks like honoring and acknowledging the importance of learning a structured series of hand positions. That whatever that structure is, right? Whatever one has received from their teacher as the correct series of hand placements, we have to acknowledge that that's going to be different from teacher to teacher. The system of practice has existed in many, many, many places and has shifted so many times that it is certainly possible to get to research back, to trace back to perhaps a relatively close, accurate depiction of what those original hand placements might have been. But I think even there, we have to acknowledge that in all likelihood, we can't be 100% certain. So that's totally fine. But we, receive some structure from our teachers when we learn the system of Reiki. And whatever that structure is, there is great value in learning that structure and applying that structure consistently when we first begin our practice. And there's a few reasons for that. Certainly, respect for the lineage and for the teachings is one of those reasons. And the purpose of the hand placements is important to remember. In fact, I want to just kind of pause here, pull back a little bit, and say that for all of the elements of the system of Reiki and for each of the practices inside of that system, it is essential to ask ourselves, why are these elements and practices in the system to begin with? What is their purpose? What are they there to teach us or to show us or to lead us to experience? They're all there for a reason. And so it's important that we don't necessarily just take on these teachings at face value and say, well, I'm going to do it this way because this is how I was told to do it, or this is how it's always been done, but to really ask the question, why? Why is it important? And luckily, particularly when we practice from the perspective of its Japanese origins, we can learn a lot about why. All of the elements in the system of Reiki from those origins are there to help guide and focus our attention. The whole system is designed to help us call back our scattered attention, to train our mind to develop mental fitness such that we can focus our attention in ways that bring about certain outcomes in our life. Ultimately, to live our lives as an embodiment of the precepts, to live rooted, spacious, connected lives, and to remember ourselves. And so our minds are tricky. Our minds are moving all over the place all the time. Our minds are easily distracted. They easily jump to the past and to the future. They easily dwell on overwhelming feelings or judgments or any number of things. And so we have many, many, many practices that help us to focus our attention on what matters in this moment. And in the case of a Ten Hero practice, we are, again, this being a body forward practice. We're allowing the sensation of touch itself, the way that that gives us an undeniable point of contact with ourself or with another being, and it gives us a point of focus, right? So we're able to focus our attention because of the tangible nature of touch and all that touch does for us, which I've talked about in other videos, touch as a healing element in and of itself, allowing us to focus our attention on our practice. And when we have a consistent, repetitive series of hand positions, that allows us to rest our mind into that pattern, into that repetition, especially when we're at the beginning of our practice. Once we've memorized those elements, it might take a little while to kind of memorize them, and that's okay. We can have a period of time where those sessions are not so much about, providing an excellent healing session, but they're really about us giving ourselves the muscle memory to remember those series of hand positions. Once we have them in our body, right, we have embedded those hand positions in our body, they've receded to the back of the mind, we no longer have to work hard to memorize them, then we rest into that structure. That structure becomes a place for us to focus our mind, to rest our attention, and to allow ourselves to move through a structure that becomes familiar, it becomes comfortable, it becomes a safe place for us to be in our practice. And having that consistency, that structure over time, number one, enhances that ability for us to focus our attention because we're resting, and it gives us a point of comparison, right? And not a comparison of what we're interpreting as happening for the other person, but a comparison of what's happening for us, right? Because if we're doing something the same way over and over again, then we can notice if something else shifts. Was I more distracted during this session? What was different about me or about the environment? Was I particularly focused? Did I feel really, really strongly dropped in another session? Again, what was particular about those circumstances? And by using that system of observation, comparison, and inquiry, and kind of review afterward, we can very efficiently develop that relationship with our practice that is essential for making this an effective lifelong practice. I always say that the most important thing in our Reiki practice and really in life in general is our relationship with it. How well do we know it? How well are we, in communication with our practice itself? And this is why, again, I think it's so important to ask that question of why. Why are the elements and the practices and the concepts and the perspectives in the system to begin with? What is their function? And therefore, what is my relationship with them, right? I can't really build a deep, fluid, effective relationship with my practice if I don't understand the elements, right? And that really was my experience with it for the first 3 years or so that I practiced Reiki, is I knew I had memorized the practices, the ones that I had been taught, which was a small fraction of the practices that are in the full system. But I didn't really understand why they were there. The symbols or mantras, for example, I was taught them in a very transactional way, right? You use this symbol to achieve this end, and you use this one to do this, but never anything about why that would be the case. Why this symbol for this outcome, and how can I be in relationship with them? So the same thing is true with Tanahira and with the hand placements. What is my relationship to this practice? Can I be in a fluid, dynamic relationship with it while still standing on a firm foundation? And in the case of Tanahira, that firm foundation begins with the series of hand placements that we can embed in our body and rest our attention into. So then, where's the flexibility? The flexibility comes naturally with practice. So nobody else can tell you. Let me revise that. A good teacher who stays with their students over time and clearly observes that student's progress over time can absolutely reflect back useful information to that student about how they might proceed through their practice. But ultimately, only that student, that practitioner, can truly feel when their practice is telling them, because of that relationship, that it is time to shift, to become more fluid, to be more responsive to what is happening in the moment, and to maybe start to flex the structure of those hand positions. And I know for me, it took a little while to reach that point because, again, the way that I learned originally had a certain rigidity to it, and it didn't provide a lot of information about why things were the way they were. So I didn't feel confident enough to follow my intuition because I didn't understand why things were the way they were, and therefore how I might mess it up if I changed them. Once I developed more understanding about what the system is, or what the elements are, why they're there, I was able to listen to my intuition more clearly and to have more confidence in how I responded to those intuitive bits of information. And so that began to look like, really being with each client, with each session, and while still maintaining the overall structure of those hand positions, making more of an assessment about where I might shift for a particular client, where the sequence might be appropriately a little bit different, where I might bring in a new hand position based on whatever it is that they were presenting in that session, to just basically work more intuitively. There's a lot of different ways that can look. If you're curious to have more conversation about that, happy to do so on another video. You can drop that question down below. That flexibility began to come over time. And similarly to building that relationship with our practice generally, I built that relationship with my intuition over time, making those subtle adjustments and then observing the outcome. Observing, did that feel good in my body? Did it feel right in the flow of my practice? And what was the response or the feedback from the client? And over time, the kind of reinforcing nature of those points of feedback, my own experience and theirs, really reflected back to me that it was okay to be flexible inside of those hand positions. And now fluidity is always part of how I approach a session. And at the same time, still following the bones of the structure that I've developed over time. And that's a good point to look at the other half of the question. Because actually, the first person who asked this question a few weeks ago, and then again, a couple of other people asked variations on questions about hand placements. But the first question was about how to be more trauma-informed in one's practice. And this came from a student who had worked through my self-paced course, Cultivating a Trauma-Informed Reiki Practice. And at the end of that course, each student is invited to make a 1-hour consultation session with me where we can talk through any questions that came up for them during the course and to help them customize the material to their practice. And so one such student asked me, is it more trauma-informed to begin the hand placements at the feet instead of at the head? Most structures that I've encountered in terms of the sequence of hand placements typically begin at the client's head. And this student was wondering if it would be maybe less intense and more trauma-informed to begin at their feet. So the question of how to be trauma-informed in our Reiki practice is a big one. It's one that I have spoken at great length about on this channel. I'll link a playlist to all of the videos that are in that topic at the end of this video and probably down in the description as well. There's a lot of different perspectives to talk about that from. And again, I teach a course in how Reiki practitioners can make their practices trauma-informed while also being reflective of their own, the way they like to do their practice. And certainly an incredibly important aspect of that, of how to be trauma-informed, how to make space for the reality that all of us are carrying around something that is particular to us that might, get stirred up when we are put in a position, or when we put ourselves in a position that is vulnerable and intimate. Certainly, a Reiki session is a situation that is vulnerable and intimate. It asks a person to really bare themselves, their body, their emotions, perhaps, maybe some of their thoughts. And it is a situation that can absolutely be healing and can be supportive of recovery from traumatic experiences, or just recovery from life generally. And it can be a space that can exacerbate those points of pain, those points of trauma and difficulty, if not handled in particular ways. And so really that's part of what is important to me to hold for our community as Reiki practitioners, to help us to demystify that a little bit, to see that as something that's not scary or intimidating. It's something we can understand. It's something that we can normalize. And it's something that we have many strategies at our fingertips to make our practices more trauma-informed, beginning with our mindsets, how we are viewing our practice. Inside of that spectrum, the way that we handle touch, right, the physical touch element of Reiki, which again is the element that most people associate with the system of Reiki. And if we're talking about Reiki sessions with clients, most often we're talking about some form of touch. Certainly there's distant sessions, there's separate considerations to be made for such sessions, but talking about in-person Tanohira sessions, physical touch is an incredibly important one to pay attention to when we're talking about being trauma informed, because physical touch is incredibly vulnerable and incredibly intimate. Can be incredibly healing to receive consensual, non-sexual, loving touch. And touch is a vehicle through which many of us have been harmed. So it is certainly a vehicle through which many people are carrying some form of traumatic experience and potentially a traumatic triggered response. And so how we approach touch in a Reiki session matters a great deal. And it's something we spend a lot of time about in the course. But I loved this question, this diving down to a layer deeper, right? Because the first step is to always ask for consent to touch, to never assume that because somebody has come to us for a Reiki session, that they automatically are consenting to being touched. We must always ask, even if it seems to be more of a formality. There's something really healing and regulating to our nervous system when we are asked and we give consent for something that might feel intimate or challenging or vulnerable with another person. So that's always the starting point. But this other layer of, okay, once we've received that consent to touch, is there a way to approach the hand positions that is more trauma informed? And so again, this is, my perspective coming from my experience and from a number of years of really looking specifically at this question of how to be trauma informed, and studying trauma informed practices in other modalities such as yoga and massage and meditation. And so from all of those perspectives, my answer to that is that there is a way to approach Tanohira that is more trauma informed. In other words, a way that takes into account the possibility that a sudden touch in a vulnerable place on the body could bring up feelings of overwhelm or vulnerability or even fear inside somebody who, might have a traumatic experience that they're carrying. We're not typically necessarily going to know, right? They might not know whether or not touch would provoke such a response. We don't have to know, right? We absolutely do not have to know the trauma histories of our clients, right? It's not appropriate for us to know all of that information. We are not their therapist, right? They might disclose some of that information to us as part of intake, but we don't, we don't have to know, and we don't, we're not entitled to know all of that information. And again, they might not necessarily know. And so we can put into place structures, right? So that when we're rooted into that foundation, when we're settling into that structure in a way that settles us and helps focus our attention and all of the things we just talked about, that it can also do the same thing for them. it can create conditions where they feel secure and safe. And so what I've observed is a really easy way to do that is to have our first point of contact, the first touch, not be in the most vulnerable place, which is going to be either the head, which can feel very, very intimate, anywhere on the face, or of course, anywhere in any kind of intimate areas of the body. Oftentimes, as I said, a series of hand positions does begin with the head. And, there's not anything inherently wrong with that. I mean, obviously, that's a very, very common way to do it. But what I have found works the best for me is to just begin with a more neutral place. Oftentimes, for me, that is the shoulders. It's still in the vicinity of the second diamond head region, which is often where we begin. But it's a little bit more friendly and less intimate. There's also a reassurance, right? The body kind of receives often a sense of reassurance when we have a hand placed on our shoulders, right? It's a common gesture that a friend will do for us, or that we'll even do for ourselves, to place the hands on the shoulders. So it's a very reassuring hand position. And so that's generally where I begin just about all of my sessions. I pretty much, can't necessarily say always and never, but I would say that I almost never at this point begin directly at the head. So across the board, for all my clients, I begin at the shoulders. When I am working with somebody who I know is dealing with something traumatic, they are working something through their system that is activated, that they might have a stronger startle response or fear response than average. Or if maybe I don't know any of that, but I observe that they are nervous, that they're, perhaps hesitant, perhaps their body language is a little bit, I was working with a client the other day that, they very much wanted to be in the session. They were giving me information, but their body was kind of doing a little bit of this, like they were just kind of turning inward a little bit. So whether or not they were aware of it, their body was indicating a sense of hesitancy, right? A sense of guardedness, right? When that is the case, when I observe that behavior in my client, or when they tell me that they're dealing with something like that, then, and I have received their consent to touch, right? Because again, we always begin with that. They have said, yes, I would like physical touch in this session. In those cases, I will tend to begin at their feet, right? So this gives me, first of all, an additional layer of distance between, my touch and their body, right? I'm also not standing behind them at that point, because even when I start at the shoulders, I am standing behind them. I'm out of their immediate sight. And, there can be this kind of sensation that there's like somebody behind you, which if you're in an activative state can cause some jitters. So we're eliminating that by starting at the feet. We're as far away from the head and from the heart and the vital organs as we can get. And of course, bringing our attention to our feet is inherently grounding and rooting and settling. And so if a person is nervous, activated, a little anxious, beginning at their feet will naturally bring their attention to their feet. And by bringing their attention to their feet, that has a naturally settling effect on the nervous system. So, kind of supporting them in settling in and kind of downregulating their nervous system a little bit so that they can settle into the session, and being as non-threatening as possible. Let's be honest. That's what we're trying to achieve here, being as non-threatening as possible. And, I say that intentionally, right? And that's not to imply that, beginning at the head is threatening in any way. But again, if we're talking about the difference between, how a person might just normally perceive what's happening. I'm in a Reiki session. The Reiki practitioner is starting where they always start at the head, versus what our nervous system is perceiving, which might be very different. And if they're in that activated state, their nervous system might be perceiving a threat, right? And so beginning at the feet is the least threatening place that we can begin while still providing a physical touch session. So that for me would be the answer to that question of how to approach a Tenohira session in a way that is the most trauma-informed that we can be. You might make a general practice of beginning somewhere neutral, like the shoulders, And you might make it your practice to really pay attention to if a client seems particularly nervous or afraid or hesitant, or if they have disclosed that they're working through something particularly traumatic. You might increase that level of safety and begin at their feet. It's up to you whether or not you describe or disclose any of that to the person, right? These are considerations you can make, ways of being flexible in your practice that can be your own judgment call in the moment. However, if they are particularly nervous, and especially if they disclose that to you, then it can be a point of connection and a point of reassurance to say, hey, I just want you to know I'm going to begin at your feet. The first place you're going to feel my hands touch is the feet. And I should pause there and say, as part of my normal introduction to sessions, I do always tell them where they're going to first feel my hands. So you're going to first feel my hands on your shoulders, typically. But again, you might tell them if they are, especially nervous, you're going to first feel my hands at your feet. I really encourage you to just kind of let that bring your attention to your feet and let that, be a point of grounding for you to invite your body to begin to relax into this session. You can explain as much of that as you wish, or just let it be an unspoken response that you do. Okay, I think that's a pretty thorough answer to those questions. Again, coming from my own study, my own research, what I've learned from my teacher, and significantly what I have learned through my 11 years of practice. And, within my practice, these structures and this mindset of being both firm and flexible, and how I approach working with the hand positions has served me very, very well, and has allowed me to be very responsive to my clients in ways that they notice and the ways that they feed back to me. So if you're a Reiki practitioner, I really encourage you to think about, just to notice where you are in that spectrum of, firm to completely flexible, what, might feel good to you at this point in your practice. And might it be worth investigating incorporating some trauma-informed Reiki practices into your way of sharing Reiki with your clients? If you're interested in going a step further with that, I will put information down below for the Cultivating Your Trauma-Informed Reiki Practice course. This is a self-paced course offered through Thinkific that walks you through about 6 or 7 hours of content that's both teaching and practice, and provides a 77-page workbook to help you to really customize and integrate the material into your practice. For those of you who are clients of Reiki practitioners, I'm hoping that this information has given you a point of assessment and a way, just another point of reference on how you might choose a practitioner that is a good fit for you and for your needs in this moment in your life. So I hope that was helpful for y'all. I would really love to hear your feedback and your experiences with any of this. Where are you on that spectrum? Where might you like to grow? What questions do you have about any of this? And is there any aspect of the system of Reiki that you would love to hear some feedback on in another video? I would love to respond to your questions. So until then, as you move through your Reiki practice, whether you're a practitioner or a receiver or somebody who's simply curious about this methodology, may you be deeply provisioned for that journey. Thanks so much for joining me. Until next time, I love you. Goodbye.